The abduction of Nancy Guthrie, mother of Today Show co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, more than a month ago has captured the attention of millions of Americans. Many of us feeling a personal connection to the emotional roller coaster of promising leads resulting in dead ends time and time again, and feeling invested in finding closure for a family we have never met. Hello and welcome to the Dr. Suzette Glasner podcast. So as a clinical psychologist who has helped a lot of people through various forms of grief, today I want to answer the question, what is Savannah Guthrie going through psychologically, and why do we care so much? To answer this, I'm going to explain what research has shown about the psychological experience of families and communities who have a loved one missing. It's called ambiguous grief. It's a complicated and tormenting set of emotions where you're grieving a loss without certainty, finality, or clarity. And Savannah has described these conflicting emotions and the deep suffering that they cause when she has spoken publicly over recent weeks. Ambiguous grief affects not only people who love someone who's missing, but also people who have someone alive and physically present in their lives who's what I'll call gone, but not gone. So think Bruce Willis. His body is here, but because of his illness, his personality has been permanently altered. And there are a number of other conditions that can lead to this feeling of ambiguous loss. And those can include having a loved one in a prolonged coma, dementia, and certain forms of mental illness where the person you once knew isn't really there and isn't really talking to you anymore in the same way that you've always related to them. So one example would be psychosis, and another would be severe addiction. People go missing every day amidst civil conflicts, violence, and natural disasters across the globe. There are thousands of Americans grieving over missing individuals after the September 11th, 2011 attack, just as one example. And when somebody goes missing and unaccounted for, the family members left behind are on this perpetual mission to clarify the fate of the missing person, and that leads them to constantly vacillate between feelings of hope and feelings of despair. They can't actually initiate a grief process because there's no body. And this is a very unique form of suffering experienced by family members, and again, it's described as ambiguous loss. So I'm going to break down some of the components of the difficult emotions that people like Savannah are grappling with when they have to live life with somebody they're close to missing and unaccounted for, and or if there is someone who's physically present in their life but is, as I noted before, gone but not gone. So in a research study, they actually looked at this. They interviewed family members of individuals who had gone missing, and there were about 5 themes that emerged to describe their experience of ambiguous grief. The first was, and most prominently, is a lack of closure. The nature of grief is already very complex, but then it vacillates between searching for the missing while also feeling like you've given up, especially the more time that goes by. So that's one of the deepest forms of suffering, is that lack of closure. And as I'll talk about later, it is related to a whole range of psychological problems and distress that people tend to experience over time when they are sort of trapped in this state of ambiguous loss. The second is hope. Hope becomes a way of maintaining connectedness to a missing person. So there's this hanging on to hope, also to just ease the pain of the loss and the ambiguity. And people are reluctant to let go of hope because if they give up on hope, it implies that they accept that the missing person is not going to return alive. And without evidence to indicate that that's definitely the case in the form of a dead body or a confirmation of their fate and what happened to them, it feels almost like a betrayal to do that. As Savannah noted, we are blowing on the embers of hope. And I think that sums up that sentiment of wanting to hope, holding on to hope, and then uncertainty about whether there's a reason to continue to find hope. Guilt is a third one. And I think a lot of us have thought about, is Savannah Guthrie going back to work and what would that mean? There's this sort of guilt about being joyful or enjoying life or moving on with life. It just feels wrong to people who are still waiting to find out what has happened to their loved one and or whether they're in pain or distress or need their help. It feels like a form of abandonment to go on with life, which makes it very difficult to go on with life as you knew it before. The next is helplessness. So the lack of reliable information about the missing person, despite trying for days, weeks, months, or for some people even years or longer, can lead a person to feel very helpless. There's also this piece of financial strain, which may be less of a concern for the Guthrie family, given their access to resources. But in general, when someone goes missing, there are a lot of financial hardships associated with spending large sums of money to search for those missing loved ones. And then finally, perpetual suffering and this sort of emotional vacuum. There's this intense psychological distress, this prolonged grief, and we often see that escalate to a point where some people even can become suicidal, which can last for years or longer because of that unfulfilled grief. We do as humans have a need to undergo a grieving process when we lose somebody, and the inability to even initiate that with any degree of certainty is really what's at the core of the kind of psychological destructiveness of this ambiguous loss, ambiguous grief. And this has sort of borne out in studies of hundreds of cases of disappearances. Rates of depression and prolonged grief disorder are triple among those who did not eventually receive the mortal remains of the disappeared person. So finding out their fate actually ends up being, when you interview people who have gone through this, the number one thing that sort of bonds them all is that they all wish for, and they wish intensely for this, knowledge about the fate of their loved one, whether it's going to be positive and they're alive somewhere or whether it's devastating in and of itself. Without confirmation of that fate, they're very prone to this sort of longer term psychological distress. And there are some people who are more vulnerable than others, the mothers and wives of a missing person, as well as older family members, and those who have a family history of mental illness. So now I'm going to move to my second question, which is, why do we care? Why? I mean, of course we care, but why do we care so much about this? Why are we affected by stories like Nancy Guthrie's? And there's two reasons I'm going to talk about. The first one is what I would refer to as collective ambiguous loss. So I talked about ambiguous loss for the person who's experiencing the loss, but there is such a concept as collective ambiguous loss. Now, Nancy Guthrie's abduction has really transformed into this shared national experience of collective loss and trauma, which can happen when death and tragedy affecting strangers is widely publicized in the media. I'd say some of the elements of this are the uncertainty surrounding her fate, combined with this widespread exposure of her personal story and her relationship, her lovely relationship with her daughter, Savannah Guthrie. It triggers this sort of collective psychological experience across the population. And this kind of public psychological engagement with her case reflects collective ambiguous loss, which is a phenomenon that has been mostly studied in relation to mass hostage taking in war and other types of disasters and acts of terrorism, not so much in relation to abductions of this sort. But in the face of tragic, particularly violent or traumatic events, such as the abduction of somebody who's elderly, ordinary people might be really abruptly reminded of their own mortality and might feel intensely violated or even fearful for themselves or for their elderly loved ones. Usually, what research shows is that with this kind of mass media exposure of a crime, as we've seen in Nancy Guthrie's case, this leads people to overestimate the likelihood of something like this happening to them or someone they're close to. And that is definitely at play here because abductions of elderly people are actually quite rare. According to statistics from 2020 to 2025, individuals in their 80s accounted for less than 0.2% of kidnapping or abduction victims. So this is really not a common occurrence, but because we're hearing about it so frequently in all forms of media, it creates this sort of biased perception that it's more likely than it actually is to happen to any one of us. When we're experiencing collective ambiguous loss as a community or as a society, when we're experiencing collective ambiguous grief, we also feel that helplessness that Savannah and the rest of her family are feeling right now. That helplessness can create a need to do something. So that leads me to my second reason that we care so much, or that we're so engaged with this story, is that communal reflection, or what's known as public grief, is something that we're seeing all over social media, with people dialoguing about the ambiguous loss of Nancy Guthrie, speculating about what happened, how it has affected Savannah, and the range of emotions that they're experiencing. And these expressions of public grief can foster feelings of social connectedness, and that can hopefully contribute to community healing and recovery from trauma. And they also provide an outlet for people who have unresolved grief from personal losses that may be triggered by hearing a story like this for various reasons. Now, the downside of public grief, unfortunately, there is evidence to suggest that social media platforms are also, and we've all seen this, they're all also used as tools to increase violence and disseminate conspiracy beliefs. And this, of course, hurts those who are grieving. So it's just important to be mindful of that. My final question is, what helps with this? Because many of us are experiencing it in some form, even if we are not personally connected to the Guthrie family. So there are a few traits of resilience that help people cope better with ambiguous loss. And if you don't have them, then there are certain forms of therapy. One is called acceptance and commitment therapy. I'll put a little bit more information about that in the description of this episode. And those types of therapies can help people to develop some of these types of resilience. And I'll just name two types of resilience as we're wrapping up. The first is called ambiguity tolerance. And it's just what it sounds like. How well do you tolerate ambiguity, mixed messages, not knowing or being able to predict what the outcome of something is going to be? It really reflects the desire for clarity, certainty, and closure, something that people inherently lack when they're dealing with a missing persons kind of situation, or another ambiguous loss kind of situation like severe addiction or dementia in a loved one. And so it's just this intolerance for these ambiguous states. The less ambiguity tolerance you have, the less you're able to tolerate things being unclear, unpredictable, and sometimes not explainable, the harder it is psychologically to cope with ambiguous loss or grief. And then the second is what we call psychological flexibility. And that involves staying open, conscious, and present while adapting or maintaining behaviors to meet the demands of the situation. It's easier for me to say than it is to do. But some of the things that help people to be open, conscious, and present are prayer and meditation. And so we know that Savannah has spoken many times about prayer as a really central aspect of how she and her family are navigating this really unthinkable trauma. So I hope you have a better understanding of what the Guthrie family is going through psychologically and what you may be feeling as you follow this story, and also navigate your own ambiguous grief and losses if you have any that you are contending with in life. I look forward to seeing you next time.